Well, I learned today that if I ever come to one of these Connect the Dots again, I need to be the first speaker because it's quite a challenge and quite an honor to be here with all of you and share my passion for early learning. So I am a pediatrician, and I am a researcher, and I am a parent, and I took on those roles in that order. And the sequencing is actually important because in spite of the fact that I was a pediatrician doing research for about 10 years, it wasn't until 13 years ago, now a little more than 13 years ago, with the birth of my son, that I got very, very interested in early learning and actually learned a lot about early learning in spite of all of the training I had gotten in medical school and residency. And so I'm going to share with you today a little bit about my journey to becoming an early learning researcher. And the title of the talk is Of Mice and Children, well, my journey to becoming an early learning researcher. And I'm actually going to start, I say of mice and children, you know, for rhetorical flourish, but I'll start with the children part first. So I'm going to begin by talking about children. And I mentioned that my interest began with the birth of my son, and my wife went back to work at 2 months, and I took off the 3rd month of my son's life to be with him on paternity leave. And I should have known better as a pediatrician because that's precisely when colic starts. And so I spent that month with him in a snuggly on one of those big blue bouncy balls, bouncing up and down and watching more daytime television than I have in my life. And I noticed during that in spite of his very, very young age, he was very interested in CNN. It could have been because he was such a good early learner, but my suspicion was that it had nothing to do with the content and something to do with the medium. And that's what actually got me interested in the effects of technology on young children. Now, I should point out that by sheer coincidence, when my son was born, I was also getting lots of questions from parents about this because he was born right around the time that baby DVDs were invented, and they're very much in the news even as we speak. In 1970, the average age at which children began to watch television was 4 years of age. And today, based on research that we've done and others have done, it's 4 months of age, like this cute little girl there, and about the age my son would have been if I actually put him in front of the television instead of putting myself in front of the television. This shift, this dramatic shift in the age, actually has occurred mostly in the last 10 to 12 years, not over the past 40. Now, in 1970, there were no programs directly targeting infants, and today there are thousands of them. In fact, there are television channels, cable television channels, specifically dedicated to infant TV. So the question is, what are the effects of all that? Well, now I know. This is a newborn brain, or this, I guess, a smaller one of these. The typical newborn brain is about 333 grams when we're born. And in the first 2 years of life, it actually triples in size. Goes from 1 fist to 3 fists. And it does that in direct response to external stimulation. If you will, we're born with our brains not fully formed. And the mind is fine-tuned to the world that infants inhabit. And I'll segue on an example that Dr. Hyde mentioned before. Any child born anywhere in the world can learn to speak any language fluently. But if they're not exposed to certain sounds in the first 3 years of life, they can learn to speak another language fluently later, but they'll never sound like a native speaker. So a child born today in mainland China will learn to speak Chinese perfectly. But if she doesn't hear English sounds early in her life, in spite of the fact that she might become a fluent English speaker as a grown-up, she'll make the standard mistakes that we have, that many non-native English speakers from Asia make. She won't be able to, for example, roll her R's. It's not because she was never capable of that. It's because she didn't develop that capacity. So the mind of our babies starts very, very early on, detecting the environment in which they live, fine-tuning itself to that. And that capacity carries forward to the entire life. Now, here's a graph to sort of illustrate that point. This is brain growth over the lifespan, okay? Years here, weight here. And look at this extraordinary growth in the first 2 years of life. Unbelievable, okay? Nothing like it over the entire lifespan. And you can see that the brains really keep growing throughout childhood, into early adulthood, and then we can find ourselves over here, some of us, and see that there's a reason why we couldn't find our car keys this morning when we were leaving. Early learning. This is the breathing pattern of a one-day-old baby listening to music. Now, most of you are not doctors. You don't have to be. This is the pattern of breaths here when Mozart is playing. And then Stravinsky is put on. And then Mozart comes back. Now, I show you this not to present sort of an infantile critique of classical music, and maybe some of you who are classical music aficionados could have a hypothesis for why Stravinsky did this to the baby's breathing. But I show it to you to show that there's actually a discernible physiological response by babies at one day of life based on what they're actually hearing. Now, I mentioned that the mind is fine-tuned to the world in which children live. And here's another graphic to illustrate that. These are PET scans, and what PET scans do is they show actually areas of brain activity. And this is a normal kindergartner's brain, and you can see that there are areas that are lit up. And the brighter they are, the more activity they actually show. And on the right here is a really tragic story of a child who spent the first 3 years of his life in a closet because of profound neglect on the part of his parents. And you can see that there are areas of his brain that are totally undeveloped, that show no activity at all as a result of that profound amount of deprivation of stimulation. So we know that too little stimulation is bad, but the question that we've had in my lab for some time is, what about too much stimulation? Or more importantly, what about inappropriate types of stimulation? Are there kinds of ways to stimulate the developing brain that are good for it, and kinds of ways to do it that actually are harmful to it? Which brings us to baby Einstein. Now, this is a baby Einstein DVD. It's called A Day on the Farm, and it's meant, as the packaging says, for children 9 months and up. There are ones that are actually meant for children as young as 3 months. And of course, parents use them at all ages. And I'll show you here a little 20-second clip from A Day on the Farm, baby Einstein style. So here it is. So in that 20-second clip, there were 7 scene changes. I don't know if you counted them, about 1 every 3 seconds. It's about the most exhausting day on the farm since John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. But the important point is, as you're watching it, you're trying to make a coherent narrative out of this. And there isn't one, right? It can be very frustrating because it makes no sense. Babies aren't trying to make a coherent narrative out of it. What's keeping them engaged in the screen is all of those rapid cuts, all of that stimulation that is, in fact, a surreal amount of stimulation, because reality doesn't happen that way. Now, I showed you 20 seconds of a 30-minute DVD that comes with an automatic repeat option. And the concern we've had, or the question we've had in my lab, is what happens when babies watch that much surreal amount of stimulation? It's important because we've all seen this, all of us who are librarians or teachers or early child caregivers. There's been a real rise in attentional problems in children in the United States. It's 10 times more common today than it was 20 years ago, and it currently affects about 10% of US children. So the hypothesis that we've had for some time in my laboratory was what I call the overstimulation hypothesis, which is to say that if you have prolonged exposure to this rapid image change during this critical period of brain development, it preconditions the mind to expect high levels of input. And by comparison, and that leads to inattention in later life. In other words, you watch enough Baby Einstein Day on the Farm as a baby, and then when you go to a real farm, whenever you do, it's boring. Doesn't happen fast enough. Why isn't stuff flying out at me? Where's the marionette bouncing back and forth? That's the theory. Okay? The same way that you condition the mind to learn to speak Chinese or English, you condition the mind to think the world is very, very fast-paced. That's the kind of world I inhabit, and that's the way my mind has to work. Well, we did a study to test that, and what we found, this was in 2004, that the more TV children watched before age 3, the more likely they were to have attention problems. In fact, each hour that they watched regularly before age 3 increased their chances of attention problems by about 10%. So a child who watched 2 hours of TV before the age of 3 would be 20% more likely to have attention problems compared to a child who watched none. Now, what else did we find? Well, we found that more cognitive stimulation before age 3 made it less likely that they would have attentional problems. Specifically, each hour of cognitive stimulation that they got before the age of 3 decreased their chances by 30%. So if you will, these are two sides of the same coin. Early learning. There are things that we can do early on that promote a child's ability, their innate ability to pay attention later in life, and there are things that we can do early on that actually impede that. And that brings me to mice. Now, for a lot of obvious reasons, you can't do experiments with babies and having them watch hours and hours of television, but you can with mice. And so for the last year and a half, we've been actually building a mouse model of TV viewing. And I'm not kidding, this is real science. I will share with you, and you're the first to actually see these, some preliminary results from our lab. So, oops. So the audio here isn't working. But this is my postdoc, Bene, and this is what we've created. So we have here, it doesn't matter, it's just cartoon sounds. These are the mouse TV lounges. And there's speakers on top here that play the soundtrack. And then on the sides are flashing lights that are synchronized to the music. So starting at 10 days of life, we put these mice in these TV lounges, and we essentially overstimulate them for 6 hours a day for 42 days. That's a mouse's childhood. And then 10 days later, we actually assess their behavior in a variety of ways, and I'll share with you some of those results. The first thing I'll share with you is the effects on activity and risk-taking. And we measure this by what's called the open field test. And what the open field test is we put mice into this black box that has 4 sides. And a normal mouse behavior is to stay close to the edge, right? Because being in an open field for a mouse is dangerous. And so that's what they will normally do. But they will venture into the middle. That's also normal, occasionally to forage for food, or just explore. And here you see a mouse actually doing the open field test, and you see how it stays around the edges. Okay. And what we do is we actually track their behavior with a computer above camera that actually tracks this white mouse on the black. And you can see here's a normal mouse pattern staying all around the edges and occasionally crossing into the open field. And here's sort of a hyperactive or risk-taking mouse, because being in the middle is not actually a good place to be. And what we found in our study here was if you look at the time they spend in the center, the entries into the center, and the distance traveled in the center, in pink here are the overstimulated mice, and in black are our normal mice. And you can see in all 3 cases, the overstimulated mice spend more time running around, more time in the center, not normal behavior for a mouse. So we also looked at learning and memory. And the way we do this is through what's called the novel object recognition. So you put a mouse in a cage with 2 objects that are different. This is actually different to a mouse. And the mouse will explore them both, because that's instinctually what they want to do. And then you take the mouse out, and you take the objects out, and you put the mouse back with 1 of the same objects and 1 different object. And the normal mouse behavior, because if he or she remembers the original object, will be to spend more time with the novel object, because they don't, in theory, know what it is yet. So here you see examples of that, where they spend a lot more time on the novel object, shown by N here, than they do on the familiar object, and here equal time on both objects. And what we found here, again, our control mouse, our normal mouse, did what we would expect, spent about 75% of its time on the novel object, as opposed to 25% on the familiar. And this is what our overstimulated mice did. They spent exactly the same amount of time, 50-50. It was as if either they didn't recognize that this was a new object or they didn't care, but they weren't acting the way a normal mouse would act. So perfect. I'll stop there and summarize by saying that early childhood for children and for mice, although I care much more about children than mice, is really critical to their development. And we really need practical, actionable strategies for parents, for caregivers, and for society to really optimize those experiences. And many of you here are committed to doing just that. And I really want to applaud you, because the work that you do, frankly, is much more important than the work that I do. So thank you very, very much for your attention and for all that you do.